Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Johnstone, Senior Advisor and Japan Chair here at CSIS, and I'm joined by my colleague and co-host, Stephanie Siegel, who is a Senior Fellow in the CSIS Economics Program. We are absolutely delighted to welcome to the CSIS studio Keiichi Ono, who is Senior Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Government of Japan, and who played really a critical role as the sherpa for the G7 Summit, laying the groundwork for the robust and productive conversations that were held among the G7 leaders. Deputy Minister Ono is a lifelong diplomat with extensive experience in both bilateral, multilateral negotiations. Prior to his current assignment, for example, he worked as Assistant Minister for the Economic Affairs Bureau, where his portfolio included trade negotiations, coordination, and a variety of multilateral fora. And I also recalled the other night your work on other issues as well, such as North Korea. So this experience, no doubt, played a critical role in producing the impressive results of the summit. Just to recap, as I think our audience is aware, the summit leaders' communique covered a vast array of topics, from climate change to Ukraine to global health. We'll get into a lot of those issues today. There was also a standalone document on economic resilience and economic security that the leaders released, and the Hiroshima vision on nuclear disarmament. We'll talk about all of that today. So we'll hear from Senior Deputy Minister Ono about Japan's perspective on the summit, on the critical outcomes. We'll take questions from our online audience at the end, so please do submit your questions via the Google form, which can be found on the event page on our website. So, Deputy Minister Ono, welcome. It's really a great pleasure to have you. Let me start by offering you the floor to offer your thoughts on sort of the most important outcomes of the summit from Japan's perspective. Please.
Thank you very much, Chris and Stephanie. First of all, thank you very much for having me at the CSIS. And I'm very delighted and honored to be given a chance to speak about the G7 outcomes and other international issues with you, the CSIS executives. So let me first talk about the outcomes of the Hiroshima Summit. As Chris, you introduced, I'm playing a role as Japan's Sherpa for Prime Minister of Japan in the context of G7 as well as G20. So I am personally representative of the Prime Minister in preparing for the G7 Summit in Hiroshima. The outcome is a kind of joint efforts by the Sherpa teams, not just by the presidency, but by all the G7 Sherpas and Sherpa teams. Even at the time of starting the preparation for the Hiroshima Summit last year, I think, we recognize that this G7 summit will be held in a very difficult setting. International society has been facing multiple crises, including COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and also we face the Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which is shaken the very foundation of the international order. So I think in recognizing that situations, we tried to emphasize the two perspectives towards the summit and also in the summit itself. The first is that to uphold the free and open international order based on the rule of law. And the second is to strengthen engagement with and outreach to the so-called Global South countries, non-G7 partners. We believe that those two perspectives are and will be very crucially important for the outcome of the G7 summit. Also, we emphasize the importance of the issue of the Indo-Pacific region. Indo-Pacific is a growing economic center of the world, and we are the only member from the Indo-Pacific region, so we stress that the leaders should pay appropriate attention to the issues in the Indo-Pacific. Actually, this has been welcomed by my colleagues among the Sherpas, that they say to me that they do understand the importance of the Indo-Pacific region by various means. But frankly, Europeans, for example, are pretty occupied by the Ukraine issue. They do understand the importance of the Indo-Pacific, but they don't have the luxury time for thinking or fully being involved in the Indo-Pacific affairs. So they say that they really appreciate the Japan's presidency to pick up this issue as a priority agenda of the Hiroshima Summit, and we did. In the summit itself, the G7 is a very unique setting in the sense that leaders have very candid, frank discussions in a sort of casual setting, not just formal speech based on the prepared talking points. It goes beyond that. And that creates the friendship and also strong outcomes from the leaders' conversations. I've had the impression as Sherpa that leaders are pretty occupied by three major topics: Ukraine, Indo-Pacific including China, and the so-called the Global South countries. Agendas are various, of course: world economy, digital, global health, climate change, the environment, Ukraine, and others. But in any session, those three topics preoccupy the leaders' discussions, I believe. For example, when they talked about Ukraine, of course, they talked about strong assistance to Ukraine and also sanctions against Russia and others. But at the same time, they talked about how to engage Global South countries in this context. In free and open international order based on the rule of law, which I just stated, this is a principle that we stressed and also supported by other G7 members, because this is a kind of principle to bridge those three issues, I think. So that's my strong impression and also the outcome from the Hiroshima Summit. As regards the outcome documents, Chris already stated, 6 documents. I always say 1+4+1. 1, leaders communicate, kind of the main body, and 4, leaders standalone statement on Ukraine, nuclear disarmament, economic resilience and economic security, and also clean energy economy. And last +1 is agreed document of G7 and invited partners leaders on food security. This is an effort, the last one is an effort to address the concrete specific issue of concern among the Global South countries, not just general terms, conceptual things or theoretical things. We wanted to address the specific concrete issue that Global South countries are facing. Lastly, President Zelensky's in-person participation was something, of course. It was very meaningful and impactful. I believe that that was impactful, particularly because of the setting, the venue, Hiroshima. President Zelensky visited the Peace Memorial Park with Prime Minister Kishida, and he visited the Peace Memorial Museum also. And he said the visit to the museum has reminded today's situation in Ukraine. So this was even more meaningful in the settings of Hiroshima, I believe. Thank you.
That's great. That's a great overview. 6 statements. That's a lot of negotiation. I can only imagine how complicated that was. Let me start with a couple of security questions, and then Stephanie will get into more of the meat of the G7 agenda. First, on Ukraine, you mentioned President Zelensky's participation. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the flavor of the leaders' discussion related to Ukraine. How do you expect that Japan will be providing to support to Ukraine in the months ahead? And what is your sense of G7 solidarity on the Ukraine issue as the counteroffensive unfolds through the rest of the summer?
Thank you. In Hiroshima, 2 sessions on Ukraine. First one was conducted by only G7 leaders on the first day. And second session was the session with President Zelensky. The G7 leaders, I think they successfully appealed their unity, solidarity among the G7s on this issue, and also solidarity with Ukraine, President Zelensky, I believe. I wouldn't go into the details of the agreed communique, of course, standalone statement, but they strongly agree to continuing the support to Ukraine, and also keeping the strong measures sanctions against Russia and the relevant parties. Japan itself, we are committed to strong support for Ukraine. And we have already announced providing $7.6 billion assistance in humanitarian, financial, food, and recovery and reconstruction areas to Ukraine. And we will continue to implement it. At the same time, we now need to address more midterm and long-term reconstruction or the rehabilitation of Ukraine. Just a few weeks ago, the Ukraine Recovery Conference took place in London, and Foreign Minister Hayashi stated at the conference that Japan has experienced the devastation of war and also a series of serious natural disasters. So based on such experiences, we would try to extend our assistance to Ukraine. We already announced that we would hold the Japan-Ukraine's conference for promotion of economic reconstruction towards the end of this year or the early next year. So we would try to extend the support from the Japanese public sectors as well as private sectors, business sectors, to Ukraine in this context. Thank you.
Yeah, Japan's role in Ukraine has been an important one. Let me ask you about the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation theme of this summit. Obviously, with Hiroshima as the backdrop, I think that sent a powerful message. The standalone statement is impressive. Yet at the same time, I think it's fair to say the nuclear threats in the region are actually growing. North Korea's arsenal continues to expand. China is investing in nuclear modernization. Of course, Russia has threatened nuclear use in Ukraine. I think you could make the case that we're actually further away from the vision of a world without nuclear weapons than we were in 2016 when President Obama visited Hiroshima. So what is really meaningful about this agenda and about that statement? And is there a contradiction in the emphasis on this message at a time when Japan's reliance, frankly, on extended deterrence is increasing?
Thank you. As Chris, you stated, the security environment has become even more severe in light of the Russia's aggression, North Korea's continuing launch of missiles, Chinese opaque expansions of nuclear capacity forces. The path toward a world without nuclear weapons has become even more challenging. But however, this is precisely why it is necessary for us to steadily advance realistic and practical efforts towards a world without nuclear weapons. At the same time, as you mentioned, the U.S. extended deterrence, including nuclear deterrence, is essential to Japan's national security. Ensuring national security and making efforts to bring the reality closer to the ideal of a world without nuclear weapons are not contradictory. So we like to pursue the both paths from our viewpoints. Japan will promote realistic and practical efforts, including the Hiroshima Action Plan, to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. As you mentioned, and also as I already touched upon, in Hiroshima, the leaders of the G7s agreed on the standalone statement. It has various concrete action plans, not just theoretical ones. And Prime Minister Kishida reaffirmed that the G7's commitment to such the ideal. Also, they agreed on the importance of the continued non-use of nuclear weapons and the imperative to continue to reduce the overall number of nuclear weapons in the world. So not just words, but deeds are also important, I believe. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ono-san. And let me stick with, I guess, this theme here with nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation as a global public good, and get into some of the other global public goods, and specifically on the development and economic side of the very ambitious G7 agenda. On health, health is an issue that Japan has prioritized, and in particular for its G7 year, made a priority once again of universal health coverage. The leaders' communique itself committed leaders to reversing the first global decline in life expectancy in more than 7 decades. So I'm wondering if you could just give some of the points of emphasis on the health agenda that came out of this year's G7, and if you could look forward a bit to the next G7 presidency and Italy, what you hope they might take forward with their G7 year.
Thank you, Stephanie, for asking these important questions. As you said, Japan has been leading the world on this aspect, particularly in the context of the G7s. Yes, Japan enjoys the highest life expectancy in the world, and this is one of the substantial outcomes of Japan's successful introduction of universal health coverage, UHC. UHC is the cornerstone of Japan's global health policy, and Japan's position remains clear that we strive to achieve more resilient, equitable, and sustainable UHC through strengthening of the health systems in the world, not just in Japan. Also, another pillar topic that leaders discussed in Hiroshima in this context was global health architecture. The G7 leaders committed to further improve political momentum towards more coordinated and sustained leader-level governance for health emergency, PPR, prevention, preparedness, and response. In September, it's already planned that PPR high-level meetings will be held, so we like to continue our efforts to the GHA issues. The third point, third pillar in the Hiroshima outcome in the global health context is that is health innovation and technology. This is becoming more and more important for us. Particularly, they committed to addressing the gap in equitable access to MCMs, medical countermeasures, including the vaccines. They announced the G7 Hiroshima vision for equitable access to MCMs that includes the concepts or the principles like equity, inclusivity, efficiency, affordability, and others. And also not just principles, they also agreed launching the MCM delivery partnership for equitable access. This will be based on our lessons, experiences in the COVID-19 pandemic. At that time, yes, developed countries, we relatively successfully developed the vaccines in an early stage, and we started the vaccinations. And the ratio became 70%, 80% of the populations. But at the time, in Africa or poorer countries, still it was single digit, 4%, 5%, something. So we need to think of the delivery and actual access to those MCMs in a crisis situations like pandemics. So we've already, well, at least it looks that we've almost overcome the COVID-19 pandemic. But the next pandemic crisis will be coming, sure. We don't know when, but it will be coming. So we need to prepare for that based on this kind of initiatives. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the great contributions of Japan in its G7 year is actually maintaining focus on health and pandemic preparedness as an issue. And as you pointed out, I think there's a very strong desire to move forward and move past COVID, but the warnings on pandemic preparedness and the lessons there should not be forgotten, obviously, in thinking about preparing for the next challenge. Let me stick with the global public goods themes and also something that presents a true global challenge that requires global coordination participation, and that relates to energy and climate. The leaders flagged the unprecedented challenges from the triple global crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, as well as from the ongoing global energy crisis. I'm wondering if you could give us some insight as to how those discussions went throughout the G7 year, actually, and talk a bit about the discussions on energy security alongside climate. How did those discussions unfold in the G7, and what again do you hope kind of carries forward again into the next G7 year?
Thank you. I actually forgot to mention the next presidency in the context of global health. I'm not in a position to, talk about the priority agendas of the Italian presidency. But generally, global health and also this energy climate issues. Obviously, it's not just a one-year shot, issue. So we, as G7, we will anyway continue to work on those issues throughout the years. On the climate change and the energy security, in Hiroshima, we had the leaders' sessions on the second day on these important sustainability issues among not just the G7 leaders, but the G7 leaders plus leaders of the invited partners and also our international organizations. They all committed to tackling this issue for the planet. They are very serious. They had very serious discussions from each positions. Of course, the positions vary. The positions of the G7 countries, or the countries like, for example, the Cook Islands, very small Pacific countries, different perspectives, different challenges, of course. But they all agreed that we need to tackle those issues, and climate, energy security, biodiversity, together by all of the international community members. G7 stresses that critical role to be played by all the parties, not just the developed countries, not just G7s, but other, the major economies and large emitters of GHGs. They also need to play appropriate roles in financing and also having the ambitious targets and working on those issues. Talking about energy security, yes, they agreed that they need to address three key things here: energy security, climate crisis, and also geopolitical risks in a holistic manner. Those three issues are interconnected, so we cannot, take one of them alone. And they agreed that there are various pathways to utilize different technologies, innovations, and energy sources according to each country's situation towards the carbon neutrality goal. So goal is the same, goal is one, but there are various pathways towards the goal in accordance with the situation, energy situations and others.
And if I could just follow up, and given actually the background that Chris highlighted, you have the perspective to identify what are the key fora for actually making progress. You noted that the different participants have different perspectives on the issues.
Yes.
What do you think are the key fora for bringing these issues forward and to forging consensus when you look ahead?
It may be difficult for us to pick up one fora because this is very complicated issues and also a wide variety of issues, agendas that we need to tackle. Of course, our COP is one of the main forums, I believe. I participated in the COP26 in Glasgow. I went to Glasgow twice. But COP obviously is expected to play the central role. But at the same time, there are many other initiatives at the leaders level. One led by UN Secretary General, another one led by the US government, and G7 and others. So I think joining those efforts, joint efforts on various forums would be very crucially important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, you mentioned up front, Minister Ono, that one of Japan's goals was to focus on the importance of the Indo-Pacific region, and in particular to bring that focus to European leaders who might otherwise be focused on their crisis closer to home. So let's talk a little bit about the Indo-Pacific and China in particular. First, just a broad question. It's clear that China was a major focus of the discussion among the leaders. From Japan's perspective, what was your main objective in driving, shaping, focusing the discussion on China among the leaders? What was your main objective?
In short, our objective is to send a united message to China by G7 leaders. My level and also leaders level, they share the recognition that G7 needs to be united in having dialogues and relations with China. So this is based on the outcome of the summit itself. G7 leaders confirmed that they stand prepared to build constructive and stable relations with China through dialogue. And also they also recognize the importance of engaging candidly with China and at the same time expressing their concerns directly to China. And the message includes economic part and also concerns on some issues like East China Sea, South China Sea, Xinjiang, human rights, and others. But on the economic parts, they declare that they are not decoupling or turning inwards, and they recognize that economic resilience requires de-risking and diversifying. Also, they stress that they don't intend to thwart China's progress or development. So, this is kind of agreed unified message to China from the G7 leaders.
Yeah, so two-part follow-up, really. First, the joint communique really does have a pretty extensive language on China. I think it's paragraphs 51 and 52 go on at some length about various dimensions of China's foreign policy and G7 engagement with China. I just invite you to say anything more that you like about, well, what do you think are the most important messages from Japan's perspective reflected in that language? But then more specifically, turning to the statement on economic resilience and coercion. This is a statement that never mentions China, but is clearly a lot about China. One of the dimensions in particular it talks about is establishing a new platform for coordinating responses to economic coercion. But it doesn't commit the G7 partners to any specific action. I wonder if you could say more about this. Is this a meaningful step in combating economic coercion, and how do you see the operationalization of this platform going forward?
Thank you, Chris. On the first point, I already mentioned kind of the main messages of the paragraphs 51 and 2 on China. G7s, they try to send a balanced message, which they like to have constructive and stable relations with China through dialogues. At the same time, of course, we need to convey our concerns directly to China. Economic security part, first of all, the G7 leaders' statement on economic resilience and economic security does not target any specific country. That said, yes, they agreed various points, including the coordination platform on the economic coercion. Economic coercion is still a new area, in a sense, and sometimes it's not black and white, it's a gray. So G7 will use early warning and rapid information sharing, collaboratively assess situations, explore coordinated responses, and where appropriate, counter economic coercion, and also coordinate to support targeted countries. So this time in Hiroshima, we agreed on the framework to cope with this relatively new challenge for us. So we need to follow it up. And actually, we've already launched the coordination platform among the G7 friends. We've started experts level discussion and coordination on the economic coercion issues.
Great.
Yeah, if I could just put a plug in for a report that my colleagues in the economics program worked on that was released earlier in the spring on economic coercion. And as you said, I think what's new is maybe an appreciation of the issue, but there is in fact a relatively long history of the use of economic coercion, which I think is the reason for advancing a platform for information gathering and potentially a collective response. If I could just stick with kind of the theme that Chris raised, China was not mentioned, but obviously China was underlying much of what was delivered through the summit and, as you mentioned, in the communique itself. I have a very specific question and then a broader one, if I could. You noted in answering earlier about energy and climate that there was variance in views. On the issue of China and responding to China, there's a specific issue that's being debated in the US on outbound investment screening. There's not been anything officially announced, but it's been rumored for months, if not years now, that something could be forthcoming from the United States. On that specific issue, was there discussion of outbound investment screening at the summit? And if you could say anything about where different countries within the G7 stand on that specific issue.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is also a new area in a sense. It's stated in the statement on economic security, economic resilience. Yes, we address and take further actions where necessary to export controls and inbound investments, and also appropriate measures designed to address risks from outbound investment could be important. So I think and that is a kind of the shared recognition among the G7s at this moment. And then what specific measures will be taken depends on each country's decision and process from now on. So I think we will continue to coordinate or compare notes among the G7 nations through the G7 framework on economic security, and each country will make a decision on what measures and when they will take or not.
Thank you. Now a broader question. You noted that there was a united message on the importance of constructive and candid dialogue with China. We know that Secretary Yellen, Treasury Secretary Yellen, is in China right now, hopefully having constructive and candid discussions. At the same time, I noted the rumors of something forthcoming on outbound investment restrictions here in the U.S. In recent days, there were new Chinese restrictions announced on critical minerals and restricting minerals that are necessary for the production of semiconductors and solar panels. So given that backdrop, I'm curious to know how worried you are and kind of the sense that you got at the G7 that we are headed in a potentially escalatory spiral. So despite the hopes that we are able to achieve a constructive relationship, that we are on a path of divergence. And while de-risking is the hope, we may in fact be headed for decoupling. Your kind of thoughts or comments about the trajectory and how successful or not the G7 was in putting a floor, I would say, on that potential for a spiral.
Thank you. Yeah, there are many things going on, even just after the Hiroshima Summit. For those 6 weeks, 7 weeks, lots of things have been going on, as Sven just described. We also had a minister-level conversation with the Chinese, like a METI minister met with his counterpart, and also defense ministers between of Japan and China met a few weeks ago. So we will continue to make efforts in having such dialogues with China, although we need to address the issues of concern if there are. But not just addressing. Again, we would like to have a candid dialogue with China for the economic and also political security affairs. So that is the key thing, I think. So continuing dialogue candidly and trying to make efforts to engage China from our side, and also we call on China to engage with us.
Maybe if I could ask
Please,
one
Sure.
question, kind of going back to, I want to pick up on the point that you made that a priority for Japan was engaging with the Global South. That was clearly laid out as an objective of Japan's. It seems that you've executed very well on that, included by looking at the representation at the G7 meetings to include a number of non-G7 economies. And actually, to your previous point, I think the Global South is among those that are not wishing to see a world that is decoupled. So, I think we've been hearing for the past few years countries not wishing to have to choose one side or another. And in part, that's because the challenges that we've been discussing actually do require broad participation. So you're not going to achieve the goals on health unless you have global participation, obviously, on climate and non-proliferation as well. As far as how one bridges to the Global South and the G20 specifically, you had the attendance of a number of important economies, Brazil, Indonesia, India, among others. What do you see being picked up from the G7 and brought over into the G20? I think we have G20 leaders coming up in September. What do you see as themes that will be carried forward from the G7 into the G20?
Thank you. Yeah, that is a very important agenda for us, actually in front of us G7 countries after the Hiroshima Summit. Next major event, one of the major events, is New Delhi, G20 New Delhi Summit in September. Actually, G7 first, there is no cooperation between G7 and the G20. Of course, you didn't say so, I know, but many people tend to say that the collaboration, cooperation between G7 and G20, because G7s are members of the G20. So we are inside the G20. I always stress that we are members, right? And G7 agendas, which I just described, lots of things to be discussed in G20 as well. We've already started the sherpa meetings for the G20 leaders meeting, and we have the kind of the common shared agendas like global health, food security, energy security, and others. So those will be tackled by G20 members, including G7 members. Of course, there are sometimes differences on the positions between the G7s and non-G7 G20 members, obviously. But this year particularly, even compared to the last year Bali Summit, we all G20 members share the sense that we need to address the substantive issues very seriously. Substantive issues mean that global health, energy, food, agriculture, data, development, those issues. Of course, a geopolitical issue is also important, and we need to tackle this in the context of the G20, like a Bali Summit. But this year particularly, because 1 year has passed since Bali, and we all share the recognition that we need to tackle the substantive issues. So G7 outcomes will be, I hope, that sort of constitute the basis for our discussions towards the New Delhi Summit.
I want to follow up on one issue related to membership before we turn to an audience question. So you talked about membership of the G7, membership of the G20. Was there any discussion among the leaders about expanding the membership of the G7 itself? South Korean President Yoon, of course, publicly has expressed interest. I think you could make a strong case that Australia might deserve a seat at the table. Was there any discussion of that, and what's Japan's view of that question?
Leaders level, my levels, at least this year, we have not discussed any possibility of enlarging the membership of G7s. G7s is now playing a role, important role, as effective international group, particularly, say, in addressing or coping with a crisis like Ukraine, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So we would like to keep that very effective group as it is.
Okay, great. Well, let's take a question from the audience, if we have one ready. So to what degree is the European community recognizing the need for continuous active engagement with Asia? And in particular, reference to the proposed NATO office in Tokyo. And do you see this focus engagement that you sort of stewarded this year continuing into the future?
Thank you. On the first part, EU itself and also the EU member states like France, Germany, and Italy, among the G7 members, they are committed to the Indo-Pacific region and engagement with the Indo-Pacific countries in economic sense and also political and military senses. We, Japan, very much welcome that kind of policy directions of the European countries, EU, to the Indo-Pacific. So in Hiroshima, leaders discussed a lot on the foreign policy towards the Indo-Pacific, but they shared the views on the many or all of the issues relating to the Indo-Pacific. NATO's office, that's what NATO will decide. So I'm not in a position to make a comment. But as we already announced, Prime Minister Kishida is going to attend the NATO summit next week. And also after that, he is moving to Brussels to have the Japan-EU leaders meeting. So I hope that their discussions over Japan-Europe, Japan-NATO cooperations will be advanced. Thank you.
Yeah, it's significant that not just Prime Minister Keiichi, but also all the members, the AP4 leaders, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand,
Yes.
once again traveling for the NATO summit. Very positive, I think, in terms of sustaining focus across regions on the common concerns that they have. We are about at the end of our time, Minister Ono. Really, we very much appreciate your time with us this morning. We appreciate the leadership that Japan demonstrated during the G7. I think this conversation, illustrates the vast number of issues that were discussed and advanced. Wish we had more time, but thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris and Stephanie. Very good conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.